Good morning and welcome to the second day. Today starts with an invited lecture by Herman Siemens. He's a prominent and respected Nietzsche scholar. We're very honored to have him and join forces vindicated Nietzsche as a mimetic precursor and as one of the most influential philosophical reference to promote a mimetic return. It's my pleasure to introduce Herman Siemens. He's an associate professor of modern philosophy at Leiden University, adjunct professor at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, and research associate of the University of Pretoria in South Africa and Universidade de Lisboa in Portugal. He's co-editor of the Nietzsche Wörterbuch, the Nietzsche Dictionary in the Gruyter, and has published widely in Nietzsche and post-Nietzschean philosophy. His publications include the volume Nietzsche, Power and Politics, Rethinking Nietzsche's Legacy for Political Thought, that Nietzsche just mentioned, which was co-edited with Basti Roth and published in the Gruyter. Also, Conflict and Contest in Nietzsche's Philosophy, co-edited with James Pearson. The 3-volume set, Nietzsche's Engagement with Kant and the Kantian Legacy, both of these in Bloomsbury. And most recently, the monograph Agonal Perspectives on Nietzsche's Philosophy of Critical Transvaluation in the Gruyter too. And he's currently completing a book on Nietzsche and Kant and as thinkers of conflict, in tandem with work on political violence and the violence of the image. And the title of his lecture is Mimesis in Baumgarten and Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. Herman, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nidas, Marina, and the Homo Mimeticus team for this invitation. I do feel like an amateur in this field since I haven't given much thought to this concept. I've focused on a range of other things. So I hope to continue learning from the extremely rich offering in this amazing meeting that you've organized. Let me then begin. In the very first line, Nietzsche announces the birth of tragedy as a text of aesthetic science, aesthetische Wissenschaft, the philosophical discipline founded by Alexander Baumgarten. In this paper, I want to investigate the notion of mimesis in Baumgarten's Meditationes, the inaugural text of modern aesthetics, and in Die Geburt der Tragödie, the inaugural text of Nietzsche's oeuvre, as two exemplary texts of aesthetische Wissenschaft. What meanings and functions do they give to mimesis, Nachahmung, and the Aristotelian doctrine that art is an imitation of nature? The main thesis is that both texts cast art as a Nachahmung of nature in the sense of natura, naturans, the creative principle of nature, rather than the order of things, natura, naturata. In both, as texts of aesthetische Wissenschaft, the creative principle of nature is artistic, Nietzsche's Kunstliebe, or in Baumgarten's words, poetic. They're exemplary texts of aesthetische Wissenschaft because the way they construe Nachahmung of nature places them at opposite ends of metaphysics, whereas Baumgarten needs both subject and the objective order of things, the nexus rerum, in order to ground his claims concerning sensate knowledge and aesthetic truth in the medium of beauty as sensate perfection. Nietzsche's artist metaphysics undermines both subject and object, even in relying on them, and ends up displacing the world, what we take to be reality, with art, a subjectless creative principle, and deriving subject and object of experience from art. In both moves, Mimesis divided between the Apollinian and Dionysian registers plays a key role. So let me begin then with Baumgarten and the key passage on mimesis. I'm going to try and share my screen. So I have to correct a bit the English translation. Representations produced immediately from nature, that is, from the inner principle of change in the universe and from actions dependent on it, can never be distinct and intelligible, but rather sensate and of exceptional, extensive clarity. They are, as such, poetic. Therefore, nature, if we be allowed to speak of a substantialized phenomenon together with the actions dependent on it as of a substance, and the poet create something similar. Hence, the poem is an imitation of nature and of the actions depending on it. So the first two statements say the creative principle of nature, natura, naturans, that is, the principle of change in the universe, is aesthetic or poetic. This statement needs to be parsed in order to understand what Baumgarten means. And I'm going to give you a rough schematization of his metaphysical epistemology. Poetic means sensate, sensitive, and with exceptional extensive clarity. In Baumgarten's epistemology, a sensate representation is one that is not distinct, deutlich, but confused or fused verworren. That is, a representation whose parts cannot be separated, that resists conceptual analysis and subsumption, and so falls below the threshold of Verstandeserkenntnis, the normal mode of understanding. A pre-conceptual synthesis or complex of relations among diverse features. The sensate representations created by nature are, moreover, extensively clear. For Baumgarten, a sensate representation is clear if I can recognize it again as a whole at a sensate level without being able to say how. That is, without being able to analyze and list its features. Intensive clarity names the moment when this first becomes possible, and so the transition from sensate to conceptual knowledge, when we begin to gain depth of understanding. Extensive clarity, on the contrary, points to the number of diverse features and the complexity of inner relations in a representation, that is, to the qualitative richness and liveliness, two technical terms, of representations that are lost in the process of abstraction. Representations that are sensate and extensively clear are poetic because the poem is defined as sensate discourse that is clear and confused, i.e., non-conceptual discourse. The more extensive clarity, the richer and livelier the representation, the more determinations its object, the more concrete and complex its object, and the more poetic the representation. The claim is then that there's a dynamic principle in the universe, a principle of change, which creates sensate representations of singular concrete objects characterized by an exceptional richness and liveliness or relational complexity of diverse elements. In Aesthetica 619, Baumgarten makes it clear that he has a dynamic multiplicity of relations in mind. I therefore believe I can rightly call those thoughts lively in which a special diversity and, as it were, a rapidly succeeding change of marks pressing each other reciprocally can be perceived, and from which, in their exceptional confusion, that radiance and luminescence of thought in particular arises, which must nonetheless remain transparent and absolutely clear in its wholeness. So the sensate representations created by the dynamic principle are each a complex of shifting relations that remains all the while an identifiable whole, a plenitude, venusta, or excess of relations that press and pressurize one another, bedrängen, generating what Baumgarten calls the infinitely many meanings of such an object that is almost incomparable in its way. That's Aesthetica 561. And as we'd expect of the dynamic principle, the objects of the sensate representations, while singular, concrete, and almost incomparable, are equally dynamic. For Baumgarten, particularity is intrinsically plural, relational, and dynamic, a plurality of shifting relations and meanings. Dynamic representations of dynamic singularia are what Baumgarten calls sensations, empfindungen. In Meditation 24, to which he refers in the opening text, he defines sensations, empfindungen, as representations of changes in the one representing. So, what he's describing when writing of the sensate representations created by the principle of change in the universe is our immersion in the world of sensations and how we sense particulars by way of changes in our sense organs. Yet, this is no humdrum prosaic world. It's a poetic world, a world of exceptional extensive clarity, full of beauties and perfections. What's striking, though, is how this world, our world of sensations, is thoroughly dynamized by his concept of empfindung when our sensations are referred back to their true source. The principle of change in the universe produces dynamic representations of changes in itself. So we have change representing change, and it's almost endearing the way Baumgarten apologizes for substantializing the nature that the poet imitates. For it's not natura and naturata, but the creative principle of change as mirrored in representations of changes of itself, namely our sensations, that the poet is to mirror. A moving whole of mirrors reflecting nothing but its own movements. What then are we to make of the poet's mirror? For Baumgarten, the Nachahmung of natura and naturans has two implications. First, that the artist creates something similar, ähnliches, to nature. Like nature, in other words, the poet creates a world, but it's not the actual world. Rather, it's a world that's possible, but different. A heterocosmos or heterocosmic fiction. And the second implication, that heterocosmic fictions have unique disclosive powers concerning the order of things in the actual world, insights which are inaccessible to empirical experience and conceptual knowledge. So, how are we to take this truth claim? On the one hand, if we take Meditationes 110, the opening text, seriously, what the poet is to imitate is the creative principle of change in the universe reflected in our sensations, not the nexus rerum, but the world of sensations in the sense of dynamic relational representations of dynamic relational singularia. Mimetic creation, then, is to create changing representations of change representing change. The truth disclosed by heterocosmic fictions is indeed a veritable truth-bearing whole of mirrors reflecting nothing substantial but its own motion. On the other hand, when Baumgarten says in Meditation 68, the poet is in a sense a maker, a creator, a poem must accordingly be a world, so to speak, quasi mundus. He concludes of the poem, therefore, as the same must hold in an analogous way as what the philosophers have known about the world. And yet the poet's world, or heterocosmos, is not the actual, but a different world. So, in what sense analogous to the philosopher's world? Unlike utopic fictions, heterocosmic fiction describes a possible world, by which Baumgarten means it must be unified and non-contradictory like the actual world. To be more precise, the poet's world must, like the actual world, combine the greatest compossible diversity or multiplicity of elements with the greatest possible unity of an ordered whole. This is, of course, Leibniz's best of all possible worlds, whose perfection and beauty lie in the accord, Zusammenstimmung, of a maximal compossible multiplicity. So against this background, poetic mimesis means bringing the hidden perfection of this, the best of all possible worlds, to light in the medium of sensations. But the laws of the poet's world, as heterocosmos, are not the laws of the actual world, not the order of things, um, the nexus rerum of natura, naturata, uh, and the poet is unbound, free to create entirely new laws and relations, to create a new world according to laws and principles, i.e., form, of her own devising, an entirely other order of things. With this freedom, art can exhibit, in a sensate manner, insights into the order of things that escape our everyday perception. The paradox of fiction, Baumgarten's most profound thought, is that the underlying connection of things in reality, often obscured by habitual patterns of perception, um, can be better understood by constructing a different possible world, a heterocosmos, at the sensate level. In the very otherness of the fictional world is their unique disclosive powers. On this account, the truth claim made for art's fictional world relies on Baumgarten's prior commitment to the perfection and beauty of the world, understood in quasi-Leibnizian terms as an objective order of things, embodying the accord of a maximal compossible multiplicity, the ordo maxime compositus. For Baumgarten, as we saw, this consists of the exceptional extensive clarity, the plurality, our richness, and dynamic liveliness of our sensate world, full of hidden beauties and perfections, and it's the artist's task to disclose them by creating a new world through preconceptual syntheses that mirror or even exceed the plurality in one of our sensate world. Now, implicit in this position is a critique of conceptual understanding and habitual patterns of perception. It's heterocosmic fictions alone that can disclose these truths because they're inaccessible to conceptual understanding and obfuscated by empirical experience. Baumgarten actually develops a strident critique of abstraction and the epistemic losses incurred by the ascent from sensate to conceptual thinking, from the extensive clarity of our sensate world to the intensive clarity of clear and distinct knowledge. But the disclosive powers of the poet's sensate world also imply a critique of our habitual patterns of perception, which blind us to the poetry of the sensate world produced by the principle of change, turning it into the prose of empirical experience. Baumgarten's project of aesthetische Wissenschaft is perhaps most far-sighted in its claim that art can and must transform our perceptual relation to things, and in proposing ways to do this. It is to be the fruit of forming or cultivating, ausbilden, our so-called lower capacity for knowledge. That is to say, our sensate faculties, culminating in what he calls the art of beautiful thinking, die Kunst des schönen Denkens, the fruit of which is beauty. let me just show you briefly how Baumgarten understands the lower capacity for knowledge. You see, there's this very long list of capacities, all located at the level of sensibility. At its most radical, Baumgarten's program of aesthetic Ausbildung presupposes that the habitual patterns of perception in empirical experience falsify the sensate world. But here again, his project of Bildung relies on Leibniz's metaphysics, this time on the side of the subject. My soul, he writes, is a power which represents the universe according to the position of the body. It's only because we carry in the so-called ground of the soul a mirror of the universe as a whole, darkly and obscurely within it, that Baumgarten can ascribe to the poet the capacity to grasp and make present the connection of things at the level of sensate representation. In the inaugural text of aesthetic science, as I've tried to indicate, the young Baumgarten formulates a dynamic concept of mimesis within a dynamic, relational, and pluralistic ontology without substance that points beyond the rationalist metaphysics he later brought to perfection. In the end, however, he relies on both a metaphysically grounded subject and objective order of things to ground his claims concerning sensate knowledge and the aesthetic truths disclosed by the sensate fictional worlds created by the mimetic artist. In moving from from Baumgarten to the young Nietzsche, we move from the high point of rationalist metaphysics to the post-Kantian world, in which for Nietzsche metaphysics is at once necessary and impossible. Impossible because the first critique destroyed the possibility of metaphysics as Wissenschaft, confining science to the world of appearances or Erscheinungen. It's necessary because of the barbarizing effect of the drive to knowledge uh, unleashed in modernity and the need to restrain it for the sake of culture. But there's also a need for metaphysics because in moving from Baumgarten to Nietzsche, we move from the best of all possible worlds to what Nietzsche calls the worst world. Schopenhauer's world racked with pain, suffering, and destruction, and the problem it raises: what is existence worth in this worst of all worlds? I see I've run out of time halfway through the paper, so let me just try very briefly to summarize some of the key points that I wanted to make in the context of the birth of tragedy. Um, what Nietzsche does in the birth of tragedy is to place metaphysics under the optic of art. And like Baumgarten's aesthetische Wissenschaft, the first principle is artistic, only it's a shattered world. This first principle is strung out between the primal one and the primal contradiction, and expresses itself in two drives, not one, the Apollinian and the Dionysian. What very briefly I try to show is that if you take Nietzsche's artist metaphysics seriously, what it does is to explode the philosophy of the subject and make our empirical world derivative of what the principle of change in Apollinian form creates, namely the world of sensations as the world of schöne Schein, of beautiful semblance. Within this framework, then, the world of Erscheinung, of subject and object of experience, is derivative of Schönerschein and arises only when we forget the key feature of Schönerschein, its self-negating quality, or what Nietzsche calls the shimmering feeling of its shine, that fine line which the dream image may not overstep if it's not to have pathological effects, lest semblance deceive us as bold reality. None of this may be missing in the Apollinian. So, in effect, what Nietzsche does here is to say the creative principle of the world creates a luminous world of beautiful semblance, which we mistake for empirical reality because we forget its shimmering aesthetic unreality of which we are aware in our dream world. So the relation between the actual world and the fictional world in Baumgarten is reversed. Fiction comes first, and the actual world is a derivative deception that comes from our forgetting or overlooking its aesthetic qualities. Um, but the key thing I think is this, that we have to ask, what are the implications for the very notion of aesthetische Wissenschaft and the metaphysics that Nietzsche posits? What are its implications if we situate aesthetic Wissenschaft within the world as aesthetic phenomenon? In that case, metaphysics, Nietzsche's primal one, etc., all of this becomes an aesthetic phenomenon. But as an aesthetic phenomenon, it's produced by the principle of change, namely the will, but the will again within the world as aesthetic phenomenon is itself an aesthetic phenomenon, a fiction, which in turn is produced by the will, etc. So what you get now, if you carry through the self-referential implications of Nietzsche's aesthetic metaphysics, what you get is Nietzsche's version of Baumgarten's endless hall of mirrors as the key to mimesis. I'm afraid I've overstepped the time allotted to me and what I could do in it. So what I'll do is stop now and apologize for taking so much time. and hopefully offer you an opportunity to raise any questions.
Thank you.